So yeah, let me just introduce myself. So this panel is about high tech in Brazil. And we have three incredible panelists here to share a little bit of their story and their thoughts. Just a little bit about myself. For those who don't know me, my name is Henrique. I am currently living in California. Before coming to the US, I built an online payments company called Pagar.me, which grew to be quite a sizable company. We've processed around 1.5 billion in GMV. And after that, we sold that company and moved here to the US to attend Stanford. And thank you very much for the organization for inviting me and the panelists to speak. So let me introduce you guys who are going to give you some real knowledge. So just give me get my notes so it's accurate. So first, Neil. Neil's an American professor here from MIT. He's director from Center for Bits and Atoms, and he started a Fab Lab network. He's going to tell you a little bit more about that in his story. After that, we have Victor Lazarte. He's the founder and CEO of TFG, one of the largest mobile gaming companies. More than 700 million people play their games. Therefore, more than 10% of the world population actually is playing their games. And Stelleo is the CEO of Mercado Libre, Latin America's largest marketplace and payment provider. So yeah, please, Neil, start telling it a little bit in 5 to 7 minutes of your story or whatever you want to tell the audience.
Great. So I want to tell you about a revolution in digital fabrication. You can think about this as the third digital revolution. The first was communication, the second was computation. Brazil is a leader in it, but you may not know that. So I'm going to take about half of my time to talk about the science and technology, skimming through that, and then half to talk about what's happening globally and in Brazil. So I direct this program at MIT to look at digital meets physical. We did things like the first computer to use quantum mechanics, part of the first synthetic organism, first things called Internet of Things, first information security and materials, things like that, right at the boundary of digital and physical. Students from this program have gone off to do things like one of my students built and still builds all the computing for Facebook. Another one of my students built all the computing for Twitter. Because to do that, you can't believe in hardware and software. You have to much more deeply look at how energy and materials transform information, sort of from all the way bottom to top. These things right at the boundary of digital and physical. That's the kind of research we're doing. The core thing emerging from this is digitizing fabrication. So to understand what that means, in 1952, MIT made the first computer-controlled milling machine. This was an offshoot of early computer development. That was the birth of computerized manufacturing. You can trace modern manufacturing to this moment. Next step in, we're developing machines that make machines. So this is rapid prototyping of rapid prototyping. These are machines made with the machines to make self-reproducing machines. Step after that is those still need conventional materials and supply chains. Rather than cutting or printing, these are assemblers and disassemblers, where with a small set of parts we can make almost anything. If you want electronics, which I'll talk about, which is a messy subject in Brazil in a little bit, you have to import a lot. Here what we're doing is we're building electronics from the parts up by coding the construction of functional materials to build integrated electronics. And finally, this ends with very serious work on assemblers that assemble themselves out of the parts they're assembling. At this very fundamental level, self-reproducing machines where communication, computation, and fabrication actually and very literally merge in self-reproducing machines. The best way to understand that is this is part of the bonus material for the movie The Martian, where I explain how to go to Mars without luggage. What are the minimum building blocks to bootstrap a complete civilization? And that's what this is really leading to. What are the minimum ingredients for a sustainable civilization? Now, that's the research. What it has to do with Brazil today is you can trace mainframe computer, mini computer, hobbyist computer, personal computer, you get the impact of personal computing. The same thing is happening for fabrication. Mainframes of fabrication, mini computers of fabrication, personal fabrication up to the Star Trek replicator. That's what we're tracing through right now. So for the National Science Foundation for outreach, we started setting up community labs. These are like the mini computer stages. It's about a $100,000 investment, about 2 tons of materials. Today, that's what you need to eventually do what will fit in your pocket. It includes a 3D printer, but it's everything else, technology to create technology. And with that, with those tools, you can make everything I show in your bottom left, boats, bicycles, furniture, electronics, tooling, all of that's not made in a factory, it's not made at MIT, it's made in a community lab. And on the lower right is the map. We made 1, and then there were 2, and then for 10 years they've been doubling. Every year and a half, these labs double. We're not pushing them, the world's pulling. It's just like the growth of the internet, but it's like an internet of bits and atoms. So we need to teach people how to do it. Alan took the How to Make class at MIT, which teaches these skills. We run it globally. We run this whole network as a campus. So this was a student in Valdora outside Barcelona. This was his homework for the class in digital fabrication. He wanted food, so he wanted to make an aquaponics system. In the beginning, he's learning design tools, then he's learning rapid prototyping, then he's learning large-scale machining, then he's learning instrumentation. So round about here, he's learning to design electronics and write programs for tiny embedded processors. Again, he doesn't have a technical background. This is in a forest outside Barcelona in the hills, but with these tools connected globally, he can learn the skills. Now he's designing the electronics, he's writing the code, and then round about here, he's eating his first lettuce. This isn't a business, it's not a startup, it's not a research team. This was homework for what happens when you get access to the tools plus the knowledge and how to use them. So that led to things like this. We ran one of these labs at the White House to help show the new jobs not coming back to the old factories. This is the former mayor of Barcelona, Trias. Barcelona's fabulous design sense, 50% youth unemployment. Whole generation can't work. They're filling the cities with these tools as part of urban infrastructure. You expect clean water and electricity. The idea here is if you live in the city, you can produce what you consume as part of the infrastructure of the city. On the right is a bill submitted by Bill Foster. I'll skip over this for time, but he's the remaining physicist in Congress to charter a national lab in the US of connected local labs for universal access to digital fabrication. That's led to projects like this. A group of cities around the world growing have joined Barcelona in this 40-year countdown to urban self-sufficiency, building on digital fabrication to provide access to the tools so that it's not protectionism. The bits come and go freely, but the atoms stay in the city. We, in turn, helped we ran a lab at the UN to show how to meet sustainable goals that led with the UN High Commissioner for Refugees and the International Committee of the Red Cross, launching a global humanitarian lab to use this whole lab network for humanitarian relief. So now to come to Brazil, there's a great group of pioneers, generally young people who are refugees from schools and companies they hated, taking leadership of this in Latin America and this Fablet organization. One of the leaders was Benno, who grew up in the Amazon jungle. As he describes it, he had 3 career choices: soldier, farmer, or terrorist, and he picked none of the above, and he's emerged as a leader of this network. There's a growing network of these labs in Brazil. These are snapshots, and I'll give you the link of them. I think there's about 40 of these so far in Brazil, really harnessing when you merge communication, computation, and fabrication. You take aid, industry, education, art, and you sort of turn it on its side and you merge them. And so while everybody's sort of looking over for what are jobs, what's import substitution, what's employment, they're over here sort of building a new economy where consumers become creators. You've got a fabulous group of people leading it. They do have some issues. One of the issues they have is you can buy the machines, but it's like a computer by itself isn't part of the internet. To be part of the internet, you need to connect to the internet. So one problem is places buying machines but not connected. Another is people buying the machine, investing in machines but not people, not investing in the community to use them. A big one for them, I'm sure you know much better than I, is the difficulty of bringing technology into Brazil. This is all about sustainable self-sufficient production, but to do it, you need the things that let you make the machines that make machines, and you need to source a number of high-tech things to do sustainable local production, and there's significant barriers to that. But with that, this is Kenzo and Heloisa, and these amazing pioneers who don't fit any conventional description. They're designers, but they're designers of form and function. They're merging communication, computation, and fabrication. They're entrepreneurs, but they're enabling not just buying and selling, but consumers as creators, really sort of creating how do you live, learn, work, and play if anybody can make anything anywhere. You have the people leading that all over Brazil, so you need a little bit of help to embrace and invest and help scale that. And so a good focus is the focus. Once a year, all these labs meet. 2 years ago, MIT hosted. Last year, the whole manufacturing ecosystem in China hosted in Shenzhen. And this year, Santiago is hosting. This whole Latin American network is hosting this global network of doubling 1,000 labs. That's a great opportunity to meet people I'm talking about and really learn how to work with them. So you're helping lead a revolution, but you may not know it. And I'd be delighted to help connect you to these people on the ground living it. Thank you.
Hi. So Henrique asked me to tell a little bit about the story of the company we started. And so my brother and I, we started TFG just over 6 years ago. So we had just gotten our degree in engineering. We studied in France. And we talked a lot about starting a software company for a very long time. And so this was the end of 2010, beginning of 2011. And that was like the perfect time to start a mobile apps company. Because smartphone penetration was going up a lot, and phones were getting a lot smarter, and people wanted software for these phones. And not many people were developing them. And it was an even better time to start a gaming company. So like over the last 6 years, like the way that people play games has changed a lot. And so before smartphones, like to play a game, you had to either like buy a console or like you had to buy a game and install it in your computer. And right now it's really, really easy to buy a phone. Like you just download an app, most of them are free. So the amount of minutes that people play games went out dramatically. So at that time, like we didn't know that, but that was the idea, right? Like people would start playing a lot more games. So my brother and I, we decided to do that. We moved back to Brazil. We moved back to our parents' place, and so we decided to start it, right? So so we're both engineers, but we're not software engineers, and like I'm not a particularly good coder. So the first thing that we did is like I turned on my computer. So like I was in like the kitchen of my parents' place, and I went to YouTube, and I typed how to make a mobile game. So I found this really good tutorial. Like, I still haven't thanked the guy, but it was fundamental. So we started working like, and for 3 months, we developed what we thought was a really cool game. And when we were about to launch it, like we took the decision of launching it for free. And right now it seems obvious, but it was not obvious at the time. Because everyone that was making money with paid games. Like the technology wasn't there to be able to make money with free games. But our rationale was, we didn't really care about that. We said, all right, so there's just so many unknowns. So the first thing we want to do is like, we want to learn how to make games. And like, so we're going to make this for free. If we don't make any money, that's fine. But we're going to learn how to make a game, right? And then, so we launched it. So it was a game like that was literally made in my parents' kitchen. And for 1 month, it was the most downloaded game in the world. So that was pretty cool. And then like, so we were extremely lucky because a month after we started making games, so Google came out with in-app purchase. So it was a technology that allowed people to make money with free games. So you cannot say that we were visionaries because like we got into the market before it happened, you know? So it was just luck. And then we plugged in in-app purchase on this game. And a company with like 6 months of age was like already very big because we have a very large user base and a lot of revenue. So at that time we knew that we're going to be able to do what we wanted, which is create a software company in Brazil. But it was also very clear that the timing was perfect and a lot of people would realize that there was a great opportunity, so like competition would get a lot tougher. So from the start, our strategy was to create a company that would survive the increased competition. Especially in the beginning, it was easy because people that knew how to play games, they were making paid games. But for sure, they would realize that there was money to be made in free games. And when these people started to make games, we had to know how to make them as well to be able to compete. So around the time that we started, like lots of people started gaming companies, and some of them did really well. But as competition got tougher in 2012 and 2013, most of these companies shut down. But luckily enough, like our strategy was right, and we continued to grow. And that left us in a very good position. Like so, right now we are one of the main players on the mobile games in the world. And being in Brazil is a big advantage for us because I think that with every technology company, it's really important to get smart people. But I think with gaming, it's especially important because everything we do is very similar to other gaming companies in the world. You know, like we use the same computers, we use the same software, and the main difference is like how smart are the people in your team, right? And in Brazil, there's a lot of really smart people, and there's not many great companies. So if you're a young, talented engineer, so most of the computer science, computer engineers that I know, what they want to do is like create products that are going to be used by a lot of people, right? So if you're like that and you're in Brazil, you don't have many choices. So most of the people, they end up like going to Silicon Valley. But I think that Brazil is a great country. Like a lot of people think that. So if you want to live in Brazil and if you want to work in a company that reaches hundreds of millions of people, like you have very few choices. And we were one of them. So because of that, like we're able to recruit talents that we would never be able to do outside of Brazil. So I think that one of the main questions of this panel and something that we're going to discuss is that technology companies, like, are they viable in Brazil or not? So I for one really think they are, because there's a lot of things that have to come together for you to create a tech company. But the main ingredient is like smart, hardworking people, and we have that in Brazil. So there are difficulties that haven't allowed us to come up with like tech giants like Facebook or Google in Brazil. But I think this is going to change over the next few years. And I don't know if we're going to be the ones that do it, but we're sure we're going to try.
That's a great story.
Thanks.
I'll tell you mine. I was sitting in a classroom like this some 20 years ago, and my mind was set on finance. I was out on the left coast at Stanford, and finance was my goal. I've been working in Brazil in investment banks. Felt as if I needed the training required to aspire to more, and so I did. I went back to school to study finance and landed in Wall Street after completing my MBA. And there, the plans that I had made got changed. I think that's the first lesson, that you make plans, but they often change. As Robert Burns, the Scottish poet, said, the best laid plans of mice and men often go awry. And mine did in a certain way. And so I met a friend who had just started this company in Argentina. And he was very, very excited. His passion was amazing. And within listening to him for just a half hour, I was convinced that this was what I wanted to do. So I left the Wall Street and came to Brazil to start Mercado Livre, a company that this friend of mine had just started in Argentina. And here I am now, almost 18 years since that day. Mercado Livre, of course, started in this age when technology was, or the internet was just starting commercially in Brazil and in Latin America. So the challenges were enormous. We talk about 3% internet penetration, where dial-up connections, slow dial-up connections were common. There were no mobile connections at the time. And it was a very competitive market. We had other companies similar to ours that were equally funded, And the challenge was to begin something that was very basic, but at that point in time, basic perhaps for many of you today, but not at that time, which is an online marketplace, very simple. Our inspiration was an American company, which was eBay, but in no ways that was what led the way. I think another lesson from these years has been figuring things out on our own. So not necessarily, and I think one of the issues we'll talk about here is whether in Brazil it's possible for us to launch technology that is original to Brazil. I honestly do so. I do so think that we can, but not just that, more than that. I think in Brazil we have people like Victor was saying here, who can execute, who can get things done. So more than the idea, I think it's about getting things done. And today Mercado Libre is, of course, a large company. We've been around. We've been a public company now for 10 years. We're in 19 countries in Latin America. We're a company that grows at more than 50% a year, as we did in Brazil last year. And the reason why that is because we're just getting started. If we look at penetration of e-commerce, it's very small. In Brazil, it's only 4%. There's no reason why that can't be more than 20% as we see in China, for example. We've been through many revolutions in technology along the way, along these almost 20 years. And that is, I guess, the nature of what we do. A lot of uncertainty, but we have to be ready for those uncertain times. So I'll leave some of the questions, and we can take some of the points there. Thank you.
So thank you very much, guys. I think that both of you, the entrepreneurship story and the work you're doing here at MIT, are an inspiration for all of us to actually go further. Your two companies are usually exceptions in Brazil in the way they are both international and they're both globally known. So we're going to explore a lot about that. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is when you go to a lot of entrepreneurship talks, everybody talks about the problems of Brazil. You have bureaucracy, and you can't rent an office, and you have to have 10 guys talking about taxes, etc. And by having built a tech company, I think that those are indeed problems, but I think they're far from being the worst problems that a tech entrepreneur has to face. They're surmountable. Like, people have offices, people have these kind of things. So, in your opinion, which are the real, hardest challenges for a company to actually grow in Brazil? We have a lot of startups, we just don't have a lot of big companies from tech.
Can I get this one?
You can start.
So, I totally agree with what you said. Some people say, oh, it's tough to start a company in Brazil because it takes that many days to get your incorporation. And honestly, if you cannot get your certificate of incorporation, don't worry about your business, because if you can't get that right, you're not going to be able to make a company. So the tough, it's true that there are bureaucracies and there are labor laws that slow you down a little bit, that get cost of labor a little bit more expensive, but those things, they change 10% or 20% the velocity of your company. And I start up for it to work. Normally it's not this 10% difference, right? It's much more you either do it, and if it's successful, it's gonna be 10 times more successful than what you thought, or it's not gonna work. So it's not this 10% that's gonna make the difference, right? So for me, what has been a challenge to grow the company is that you have a lot of really smart people coming out of college, but what you don't have is people with experience in tech companies. So it's very, very hard to hire middle managers. So it's very hard to hire people that understand how to manage a tech company, because it's very different from traditional companies, right? So when Facebook was getting started, they stole a lot of people from Google. And when Google started, they stole a lot of people from Microsoft. So if you're in Brazil, it's really tough because there aren't many people that that have done it before, right? So you have a lot of raw talent, and raw talent, like it's much easier to recruit that raw talent. But then you don't have people to tell these people what to do, you know? Like, and even like founders themselves, like they don't really know what they're doing.
I can vouch for that.
So talking is like having these people that have a few years of experience that can help you, like, because there are things that are known of what you should do on a digital company. Right? I think this is really the hard part.
I focus on the solution. I think focusing on the problems, you'll get problems, and it's the wrong focus for me. So yeah, I mean it's challenging. It's challenging to start, get the certificate of incorporation. It's challenging to get people. One thing we talked about yesterday in the panel was training people. Was really dedicating a lot of effort to developing your people. That raw talent that Pilar was saying, we do find in Brazil. Sometimes that talent requires a lot of effort to develop. But I think any entrepreneur has to look at the problem and think, what can I do about this? And that's basically how I think.
So I'd like to strongly support something you both said, but challenge an assumption so far in this session. So there was a study last year, businesses from MIT add up to the world's 10th economy. It falls between India and Russia. And that's just crazy. It's a few thousand people at a time equaling the output of a billion people. What I've learned from this Fab Lab network is exactly your point, which is anywhere we open these community facilities, exactly the same bright inventive people. They're just no different from the ones here. It's not that the ones in Silicon Valley here are any more capable, it's just this is the place where they can work. They're everywhere. But given that, the assumption is, what is a business? The goal is economic activity, the goal is social impact. I backed into creating these 1,000 Fab Labs. They're doubling every year and a half. Each of them, say, has 100 people in them and they function as a network. So in a sense, I created a business with 100,000 people. They're all sustainable economic activities, but no one of them is a critical mass. It's only the network. And many of the most successful business models in them don't sell in the product, they sell the benefits of doing this in the community. I'll tell you more about that. And so to connect the 2 points I just made, don't fight the last war. The next Silicon Valley is in a different valley. The next Kendall Square is in a different Kendall Square. It's a network. The merging of communication, computation, and fabrication means instead of viewing business as a segregated activity and as a geographical activity, it's happening in these much more permeable networks. And so the question isn't, can you do it in Brazil or out of Brazil? You have this richness of bright people, but you want to figure out how to connect them into these global networks.
I completely agree. I think there's a lot of opportunity to connect talented people to this network in Brazil. And that's some of what I think we're doing, yeah.
Yeah, this whole session reminds me a little bit of, I went to a retreat of all the elites of France, the heads of the government, the heads of industry. And I was in this horrible session where the session was, can you innovate in France? And all the leaders of France decided, no, we should move to Kendall Square in Silicon Valley. And I was telling them, you're looking over here where you're depressed, and right under your nose is all this innovation in France, but it's just not where you're looking.
Yeah, but like, so that, like, I totally agree that, so now, like, people are more connected, so, like, you don't, like, being in one center is not that important anymore, like, you can distribute it, but there's still some challenges. For example, like, raising capital. Like, this is a local phenomenon, like, raising capital. Like, venture capitalists, like, they like to invest in people that are close to them, like, they like to see them, right? So if you're a company in the valley, like, the terms that you can raise money are just so different than if you're in Brazil. So I'm just gonna give you, like, my personal examples. Right? So my brother and I, we started this company, we had a product, we launched this game called Racing Penguin. This game went on to make like tens of millions of dollars. We had already launched it. It wasn't that successful at the time. And so we didn't make a lot of money, but we went around and we tried to raise around the finance, right? And then like we got a term sheet. And the term sheet was, there was this guy that had a big fund of like tens of millions of dollars, but he was doing equities. And he said, all right, I'll do venture capitalism. So his proposal was like, I'm gonna give you like $80,000 and I want 50% of your company. And I'm like, no. It's like, we have a product. It's like, it's a game that is doing really well. Like my brother and I, like we both graduated top of our class in the best engineering program in Brazil. So like, no. And like, so I have some friends that are really smart, like Henrique, for example, and like they're out here, and some of them like they raised their first round of financing. They don't have any products, they don't have anything, and they're able to raise like $1 million, a $10 million valuation. You know, so like I think that it's fine, like you can do things all over the world, but there are some challenges specific to being in Brazil, and like raising capital is perhaps like the most difficult. I don't know.
Well, let's add a little spice to this, because I agree partially with you. But we have two famous VCs in Brazil sitting in the room here who have financed, have some $1 million already invested in Brazilian companies. So I agree with you, but getting back to the original point, there are problems. There are difficulties, obstacles along the way, but they're not insurmountable.
Yeah, no, of course, I agree.
Yeah, I think that, like, to a point, it's important to identify the problems in a more specific sense so we can actually get people to work towards solving them. Unless, like, if you just say, yeah, there's always going to be problems and, like, we always have to find a solution, I think that it's a little bit generic, so it's hard to people to actually get involved. To, okay, like, the problem is VC money. Maybe, like, what I should do is, like, I don't know, raise a seed VC fund or something like that, you know, like, and get better terms. Or, like, if you don't specify, I think, like, exactly what are some of the main challenges, it's hard for people in the audience who are graduating from the best universities to actually go and try to do something about it.
Yeah. So here's like a specific advice. So like if you're in Harvard, chances are you can raise money outside of Brazil. And if you can do it, do it. So I think a very good formula, and like if I was starting a company right now, what I would do is like I would try to raise VC outside of Brazil and then start a company in Brazil. I was just gonna get better terms. That's it.
Yeah. Awesome. Someone to raise on both. I can attest to the difference.
I was plugging for the Brazilian VCs, but
yeah, I think that like there's a lot of value in people who actually know the local market and can help you unlock all those local connections.
Don't be political, man. Come on.
Let's go to the next one. Okay. So going international. Very, very few companies has actually solved this challenge. Like you don't see global Brazilian tech companies. You two are maybe like, if there's more, I'm not remembering the top of my head, but like there's the two of you and maybe like 2 or 3 more. How and like what were the challenges and like how do you entrepreneurs, how can help entrepreneurs think about that in this sense?
As I said, my friend who started the company is Argentine, and he started there. But in no way was he thinking of the company as in terms of being a company that was restricted to Argentina. In fact, Brazil is our largest market by far. It's about half of our business. And I think the lesson there is to go beyond your boundaries, you know, and we see potential beyond just the boundaries of Brazil. And often what I see is that Brazilian entrepreneurs are thinking small in that sense. You know, they're thinking in terms of if I can only get my product to be adopted, if I can only get Brazilians to use my product, and there's no reason why we shouldn't think beyond our boundaries.
Yeah, so I totally agree with what you said. And I think it's understandable that Brazilians, they think about the Brazilian market, right? And it is like thinking small because Brazil, like the digital market in Brazil is like 20 times smaller than the US. But it's not because Brazilians are not smart that they think about the local market. I think it's because when you think about starting a company, you want to start a company in something that you know and something that you're seeing every day, right? So like if you people in Silicon Valley, like they start a company targeting the US and the world because like that's what they're seeing every day, right? Like they're seeing like people around them starting companies that target the US and target the entire world. And in Brazil, like people they don't have these examples, and like they live in Brazil, they think about this society, and they target that because like they haven't thought about, oh, I can do something global. So I think that Israel is a great example in that sense, because like they're this tiny country, like they have a very small market, and the market is so small that it makes no sense for them to try to target Israel, right? So like they go and target the world. So I think that back to your first question, like one of the challenges of starting a company in Brazil is that the size of the market is not that big, right? And if it's not that big, like it's gonna be hard to attract investments. It's gonna be hard to to get big. And I think that if people in Brazil they start thinking, all right, so it's possible, I can target the entire market, So I think it's not really a challenge. It's not really more difficult to think about like a global thing. It's just that it's not there. It's not part of your everyday life. I think that's why people are not thinking about it.
Let me belabor once again an assumption that is maybe a heretical question for where we're sitting on campus, which is, what is the purpose of a business? So, one of them is you get rich. A lot of the goal of a business, and I think in this session, is transforming the world, transforming the economy, sustainability, quality of life. And again, those get casually equated, but the technology is challenging that assumption. I was recently with Paul Kagame, the head of Rwanda, and his economy minister, and they were struggling with these questions of how do we launch businesses and how do we do with import substitution and trade deficit. And it had just never occurred to them to invest, rather than trying to create jobs to get money to then produce products. If the tools let you create the product, if the consumer becomes the creator, it sort of challenges that whole supply chain. And it had never occurred to them to invest in the infrastructure. So again, I would just stress, emerging communication, computation, and fabrication sort of breaks this litany that you need companies to have jobs, to have work, to have income, to produce, to purchase things. You can go right to the consumption. Think about how personal computing blew up the traditional computer industry. That's what's happening for the physical world around us. And so I'd suggest sort of teasing apart the goals of I get rich, which is fine, from the goals of the transformation of the society, which is really changing very quickly when you merge the technology.
One thing about that though is, I think that there has to be some sense of purpose or passion behind what you do, right? And so a lot of companies get started not just with the sole purpose of making their founders rich. I think if there is a purpose behind what you do, then it's more than just being a company for that sake.
Okay. So now we talked a lot about talent and ideas, and people want to start companies, and if you ask most young students in Harvard if you want to be an entrepreneur, most people would say yes, right? It's something that it can have a big impact, school, etc. And there's a lot of myths around how is the life of actually running a company? How is it really like in the day-to-day? I'd like you guys to talk a little bit about not when you're raising money, not when your conference is talking at panels and about problems of Brazil, but literally that 4 p.m. in the office in a Wednesday afternoon. How is it?
4 a.m.
Okay.
Well, 4 a.m. I would say. No, I think definitely there's a lot of glamour around being an entrepreneur, which is actually bad marketing. I think it's, or as we say today, it's alternative facts. Because the life of an entrepreneur is nothing but glamorous. I think is that you'll have lots of free time. That's why I say 4 a.m., not 4 p.m. And of course, the myth that you will become rich is also, I think, another one. So none of that. I mean, yeah, we're sitting on this panel, we're telling the story of something that worked out, but before there are probably hundreds and thousands of people who are not sitting on this panel who have tried things and haven't gotten it right. So yeah, I think it's not necessarily glamorous. You won't have any free time, and the chances of you actually being successful are very slim.
I wanted to pick up on something you said relative to that. So like, out of the $1 trillion of business volume from MIT, my lab maybe made $1 billion a year. And what's really interesting about it is 0 of that started with a business plan. 0 of it started with, I want a company and here's how I'm going to make a company. All of it starts from 2 things. One is a vision of change in the world. And one of the biggest drivers is, I can't find a place to work. I want to spend my days doing something I want to do. And I stress it because I have a business plan here. I'm going to make money is a good way to make $1 billion, but the sort of the $1 billion doesn't come from that. It comes from this deeper arc of change I want to see in the world and change I want to have in the world around me. And when they hit the reality of starting the company, always every single one has nothing to do with where they started. Like the students who made the first quantum computer ended up using the reference platform for RFID tags for retail. You know, we've done so many of those, but it's powered, to your point, by this vision of change in the world that drives you through it. And so if you're starting to be an entrepreneur as a business plan, you'll probably be really unhappy. If you're starting with a vision of change in the world, you'll probably succeed. It'll be difficult, but you'll probably succeed.
So I think, like, just to make this point that Stelleo was making, like, I completely agree with that. I think maybe like the hardest thing about starting a company is that there's just so much uncertainty, right? And it's like, it worked out for us, but the reality is like, there are people that are as smart or even smarter, that are as hardworking or even more hardworking than we are, and like, it just didn't turn out okay for them, you know? And like, so I think my advice is that, like, really like, get okay with failing. Like, if you're starting a company, like, you gotta be okay with failing, you know? Like, so when my brother and I were starting the company, like I said, like, we quit our jobs, and like, I turned to him and said, all right, so what do you think is the probability that, so we told each other that no matter what happens, like, for 1 year, we want to give that a shot, you know? And so I asked him, like, what do you think is the chance that 1 year from now, like, we'll spend every single dollar that we have, which was not much, and then we were gonna end up with like no money, no job, and we're gonna be like crawling back to our old bosses and like begging for our jobs back. And he told me like, I think there's a 75% chance of that's gonna happen. And I was like, okay, I can live with that. That's it. And I think, and the thing is like, that's reality. Like, there's a lot of uncertainties, and it's really, really stressful. Like, you don't know if it's gonna work out. And even if it does work out, you know, like for us, like it's pretty cool. Like, we're here, we get to talk to you, it's awesome. but then like you're working so much, and like there's just so much pressure. Like it's not like you're gonna relax. Like you're gonna work so much, and then like for it to work, like you gotta create this culture that everyone needs to be very hardworking, and like everyone is looking at you the entire time. So a lot of pressure, and then. If you're in high tech, things are volatile, and like you're doing well, and then people start to know that you're doing well, and then all of a sudden you're like, oh my god, when all of this is gonna crumble, and then people are gonna like look at me like, oh, I always knew this guy's gonna be a loser, you know? It's like there's a lot of that, you know. It's like I think that I think just like the intensity is very, very hard.
Cool, so we're gonna open up for questions, but before that, the last question. So a lot of panels about entrepreneurship, I see like people ask a lot about what are the sectors, what are like good areas to look at. I'm gonna ask you guys something more specific. Give these guys a cool business idea they can start working on.
When he asked that question, he actually told me he was gonna ask this question. I was like, for free? No way! No way. But I'll tell you something. I almost lost my flight to come here. I was in São Paulo, and it took 2.5 hours to get to the airport. It was raining, and when it rains, traffic stops. And I was thinking, there's got to be a way that we can do something about this. Well, we have our ex-mayor of São Paulo sitting in the room, by the way. And there's got to be a way that someone with access to data, smart, connected, can do something about it. So it's not easy, obviously. It is not a free idea, but I would love if someone were thinking about how to solve there's a lot of, and I think MIT is a center for thinking in terms of possibilities and what can be done. So it's not a specific idea, because that would cost you, but I would love if someone could solve that problem.
So one just quick comment about that is that, just funny story, there was this startup hacker that figured out that Google wasn't validating like the Google Maps traffic thing. So before he went to work, he actually sent like packets to the Google saying that all these guys were going to the same route, so Waze from everybody redirected them from other routes and didn't have the freeway to go. No traffic at all.
That's not using technology of a good cause.
Yeah. Just saying out there.
So AI is like a big buzzword, and I think it's a big buzzword because like it's a lot of things on AI are gonna happen, right? But like if I say, oh, so what's a cool business? Start a business in AI. That's stupid, right? Because like it's the same thing as saying like start a business in software. AI is so vast. But very specifically, like if I wasn't doing what I was doing, like I was gonna do AI to change something. So like find a problem that you know that AI is gonna change and try to create a company on that. So I think one good idea is when you go to the doctor, like normally like for everyday consultation, like you go there, like he has to do like a few questions, and then he says, oh, you have this, you have that, and like it's obvious that this is not gonna go on for a very long time. You know, like I don't know if in 5 years or 10 years, but like going to the doctors is gonna be something of the past. Like you're gonna talk to a computer, you're gonna tell them for simple things, of course. You're gonna go to a computer and you're gonna ask them like, all right, so like the computer's gonna ask you a few questions, and then it's gonna tell you what you have. And this is a global company. Like I think so. What you need to do then? Well, you need data. I don't know how to get this data, but you need
Chupeta. That's fire.
That's the fire.
So I think that's what I would do. And like there's small variations of that, right? Like using AI to solve problems that you know that in the future they're gonna be made by computers, and go and do that.
So I'll give you an opportunity, but then I'll challenge it. So the opportunity is, the picture I showed you of that milling machine was connected to the Whirlwind computer that got commercialized as the PDP that was used to create the internet. That became DEC. DEC created Route 128 computing, which is Wang Prime, Data General. The whole computer industry was right up the highway from here. The head of DEC famously said when PCs came, nobody needs a computer in the home. DEC is twice over bankrupt. Compaq bought it, Compaq failed, HP bought it. All of Route 128 failed. The conclusion was it didn't matter what you did for organizational change. So that's where we are for manufacturing today. The stuff around us, energy, food, consumer electronics, is exactly going through that transition. So the opportunity is digitizing fabrication disrupts the whole physical world. But it doesn't mean what you think. It doesn't mean there's a new Apple or IBM to be created, because if the machines can make the machines, it's not a good business to make the machines. And so I come back to the thing I keep stressing, which is beyond smart cities, is fabric cities where consumers become creators, where bits come and go, and you can produce what you consume, and it gets to the heart of why business. And again, if the question is not why business, but how to make sustainable, productive, happy lives, that's a very different one. We're deploying a lab in a couple months in Bhutan, the home of gross national happiness, but led by crap from India, to help Bhutan become self-sufficient. Consumers becoming creators really gets to these fundamental questions of why are we starting businesses, and it's a very different kind of model emerging.
Cool, guys. So first, I want a round of applause for our panelists. We open up for questions, and there's one thing I want to say is that hard questions are allowed. Okay. How about?
Address a question to the professor. Inspired by the Barcelona experience, we launched in São Paulo the largest network of Fab Lab facilities. But we have a problem we have to face to integrate the facilities with the school curriculum. How would you face this problem?
May I speak bluntly?
Yeah.
Yes.
The Fab Labs in Brazil are very unhappy with your Fab Labs. And the reason is, but I speak bluntly because I really would like to help work with this. It's because they were an investment in the machines, but two things were missing that you identified. One was the connection to the bigger network, and one was the investment in the people. And so crucial to that question is, and I consider MIT's core competence as it's a safe place for strange people. People who wouldn't fit sort of find a home there, and the Fab Labs work that way, bright, inventive people. So much of the strength of the Fab Labs actually are exactly the people you're talking about who get frustrated and fight with their teachers and don't like the companies because they're inventing. And so what you want to do is, what you did is great to create the labs, but there's a crucial next step, which is, do you want to connect them not just locally, but regionally and globally into this growing network? You want to leverage the programs in the network, like the Fab City program and the Fab Academy and the Global Humanitarian Lab. And you don't want to limit it. The only Fab Labs that we have fail are ones that are too tied to schools with a rigid curriculum that say these are the rules and these are the steps. And so it's not just the technical engineering, it's the social engineering. And I would love to help work with you to do the social engineering to connect it in the city. The social part is as important as the technical part. And I think that would be my answer as the next step for you.
You mentioned that eBay was the inspiration for Mercado Libre, and we're talking about high technology. And how did you see Mercado Libre today compared with eBay regarding technology? And 10 years ago, you see this trend, this gap closing. You guys are still like behind. You guys are on the same level.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it opens up the discussion also to this idea of copycats, which is often talked about in technology. A lot of companies get started inspired by a company here in the US, and then people think it's all about just replicating whatever path that company took. One thing we learned early on was that that wasn't sustainable for us in the long run. So, for example, so eBay was an auction site when it was first launched in '98, and our model when we first launched was eBay was public in '98. It was launched a few years back. When we launched in '99, we also launched with that same auction site model. And auctions were very frustrating for people involved in them. They still are, particularly if they're competitive and early on during the auction process you reach the price that buyer and seller were content with, but they had to wait until the auction period was over. So we launched this feature called Buy It Now, Compre Já, and we did it before eBay did. And lo and behold, what we saw is that people started using that feature in such a way that Compre Já, what it was, Buy It Now was established a price at which you were happy selling your product, and when that price was reached, the auction was over. You didn't have to wait until let's say 7 days, which was a traditional auction period. People started using that feature by setting their initial price equal to the Buy It Now price, essentially making it a direct sale, not an auction. And it took years before eBay decided to launch a Buy It Now feature, many years after we had launched. And then at some point in time we saw this was either selling fixed or auction, and we did away with Buy It Now. And eBay, it took them many years. I don't even know if they still have that feature. I think they might still have that feature. The point is, I don't think there's any gap between us or eBay or Amazon. I think it's you don't have to take your cues from from any global player. I think there's talent in Brazil to solve problems. Of course, we admire a lot of these global companies. We identify what they're doing, not only in the US. We have good relations with companies in China, in Japan, in the Middle East, in Eastern Europe, and we learn from all of them.
The questions for Stelleo, but can stand for the others. Can you break like a protocol for putting a move that's gonna illustrate my question? Is already available on YouTube and it's like 1 minute movie. And I'm gonna do it together with the caster. Can you do this?
Yeah, I can try.
Can you try? Oh, you try?
Can you come here?
Sure.
Does someone want to go for another question? Yeah, let's see.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I'm currently, my background is in finance and economics, but I've switched into artificial intelligence recently, and now I'm doing a master's in AI. And I would like to know a general perspective on how advanced is AI in Latin America, Brazil, in order to be able to play a major role to reverse the economic slowdown.
Sorry, guys, I warned.
I can't say how advanced AI is in Brazil. I do believe one thing, in this world of data and decisions, I think we're better prepared now than probably in the age of large capital requirements for fabrication, which was probably a prior age to this. So what I mean by that is having talented people, creative people, people who are willing to solve problems, facing large data sets. I think there's the opportunity for a lot of good things to come out of Brazil. I can't speak for the state of AI in Brazil.
I would, if you're going down that path, I'd encourage, do your homework. So the Internet of Things is popular. I work with the Internet architects at the beginning. Much of what is called the Internet of Things today is the BitNet of Things. It completely misunderstands the architecture of the Internet. In the same way, AI went through a first boom and then bust. In the sort of Minsky era, it went through a second boom and bust in the neural network era. Right now it's in the boom phase and it's queued up for the next bust. And what's emerged from each of those busts aren't recent new ideas, but actually ideas that have been pretty much back from the beginning of the mathematics. So be scared when you hear AI. There's a lot of baggage and it's queued up historically to crash, and what emerged from the crash is something more interesting. And so I just encourage you to do your homework. For the ideas that have lasted through those boom-bust cycles.
Yeah, so on that as well, AI, I think that not many people in Latin America are talking about AI. So like not many people know it well enough to start a business on that. But I think that the really cool thing is that if you're starting a company based on AI, you don't need a large number of people that understand it really well, you know? Because like any person any group that is going to do that, whether like they are in India, in Brazil, or in Silicon Valley, what they're going to do is like they're going to get a lot of papers on the internet, and it's going to be a small group, maybe like, I don't know, 3 or 5 engineers, and they're going to start something. Like you can do that in Brazil. You know? So I think that Brazil is as good as a place as any to start an AI company that has global ambitions.
Oh yeah, there's.
Okay, so I have a proposition for homework for you guys. The first thing, like we were hearing when talking to them, is smart cities, right? This term became fancy, everybody talks about it. But the first question is, aren't people what makes cities smart? Because this whole logic that putting sensors all over the city is going to make it more efficient is a bit like not based in reality. All the studies we're doing are showing that cities behave like our nervous system, right? We have involuntary movements and voluntary movements. Maybe for the involuntary one, the so-called smart cities could be useful. But for the choice that people have to make every day and necessary for the building of community and society, smart cities do nothing. So what do you have to say about it? And lastly, can we integrate physical and digital space better for better things than Pokemon Go? Why are you guys not dedicated to that?
Sorry, what was the second part?
Can you integrate physical and digital space for better things than Pokemon Go? Why isn't the community dedicated to that?
So, I'll leave Pokemon Go for you, but for the
He's the expert, he's the expert.
Pokemon Go is great, you know? At least they're integrating it, right? Like most people are not using it. So I think it's a step in the right direction.
But to your first point, smart cities are wildly overblown and not that interesting. It has a role, but again, to come back to this thing I keep repeating about this transition from smart to fab cities, if the question is not is it smart, but can the city produce energy, can it produce food, can it produces all the things you need to live? It's not protectionism, I want to keep hammering that. Instead of products coming into the city made far away and trash leaving the city, the model is data goes in and data goes out. The bits come and go. You can only do this if you're in global networks. Again, coming back to the Sao Paulo question, you need to connect globally for the knowledge, but the atoms can stay. So the really interesting thing for me is not you have sensors in the city, but is the city sustainable? Can it produce energy and food and all of the products? And that's the really interesting thing happening. It's sort of a back to the future of cities being able to produce what they consume, building on the technology. And then the question is, if you have energy and food, it's not a subtlety, that's sort of existential for why even do cities exist.
So I was about your first point, which is people, and thinking about what I do. It's great that Mercado Libre is this company that has a $9 billion valuation, that's in 19 markets, that has almost 200 million users. But the real interesting, I think, aspect of what we do is connecting people. And the stories that I can tell are the stories of our sellers. By the way, I'm just looking to you, and straight ahead, the two guys who started, straight ahead of you, the two guys who started selling online. That's how they became entrepreneurs initially on Mercado Libre. Thales Gomes, founder of Easy Taxi, and João Mendes, founder of Urbano. And those are the kinds of stories, the stories of people. I mean, they've gone out, of course, to do much greater things than when they first started selling on Mercado Libre, but it's the story of people. And like them, there are like 100,000 stories of people who have started businesses on our platform.
Me?
Yeah. I have a question for Professor Neil. You mentioned that Fab Lab is creating a Fab Lab in Bhutan, and there's a very special case study on happiness, right? And so my question is actually kind of two questions. One is, what do you hope to get from Bhutan to the, how do you think the city can impact the greater network of Fab Labs, and how do you make these local Fab Labs impact the greater network?
Yeah, so first of all, to stress, there isn't a head office that is colonizing the world like with McDonald's franchises. This goes from people opting in, so that they approach us to join this growing network. Bhutan measures gross national happiness, but it doesn't mean they're happy. And it's a really important point. They recognize the goal of the economy is not the dollar volume, it's livelihood, it's all these measures, and they measure them and they understand their problems. What we're doing with them is they have a great sort of technology for the brain, for the monasteries and the Buddhist tradition. But if you go down the street in Thimphu, there's streets with crap trucked in from India. They don't have control over their physical environment. And so it's a very concrete thing of like, I spent an hour with the Prime Minister on rice cookers. In the modern economy, they have to import rice cookers from Japan, but they're expensive and then they're the wrong size and all these issues. And just the notion that they can sustainably produce rice cookers for Bhutan that meets the needs of Bhutan with a closed cycle economy in Bhutan is just a very, very concrete, practical one. So that's the answer for Bhutan. But one of the surprising things for me is when we set these up in war zones or rich places, they actually get used exactly the same way. It's not that poor places or developing places use them differently. The people are the same in them, and they actually use them and share them in all the same way. So again, I would come back to, it really is the power of the network. Bob Metcalfe famously observed the power of a computer on the internet is the square of the other number of computers on the internet. And that's the same thing happening here. The business models we keep coming back to, any one of these sites can't do it by itself. It can only do it when it's part of the bigger network.
Okay, one last question.
We have to.
Can you have your
Can I do
video?
that my one?
Yeah, well, let's leave that for last.
Right.
So I wanted to ask Victor and Stelleo for their stories on their first customers / users. How did you acquire your first 1,000 users or your first 1,000 buyers? When you finished the product, what was in your head? What did you do and how did people react?
So we started a marketplace, and a marketplace requires buyers and sellers. And how do you start when you have 0 buyers and 0 sellers? You start with the buyers, but they'll come and there won't be any products. That's not the right way to do it. The right way to do it is starting with the sellers, but if you start with the sellers and you don't have enough buyers, then you won't have liquidity and you'll have frustrated sellers. So starting a marketplace is a really, really hard thing. The way we started was actually, and this was 1999, was we would go down to streets like Teodoro da Silva in São Paulo, which is a street known for stores that sell musical instruments. And we actually knock on doors and say, would you like to sell online? And people would ask us, what do you mean? No, we have a system where, give us your products, list of your products, and we'll put them on the internet. What is the internet? No, don't worry about it. People will start calling you. And so that's what we did. That's how we started, was actually knocking on doors, on physical doors, getting lists of products, and that's how we of course would sell our own items as individuals, people who were working in the company, friends and family, and then we got some money for advertising, and we started also getting buyers, and then the rest is history.
How did you get the first buyers? I'm sorry.
Well, again, with our own network, but then we invested some money.
Yeah, and so for us it was like a little bit different. So our rationale was we looked at things and said, so what should people be doing that they are not doing? So what technology was created recently that allows people to do something that they want to do but they're not doing? So for us it's like, all right, so everyone has a computer on their pocket. And people like to play games, so they should be playing games on these computers, right? So we tried to look for a demand that was already there, but no one was satisfying that demand. So we thought that games was it. So we created a game, and so we didn't at the beginning, we didn't need to do any push for people to consume our products because the demand was already there, right? So for us, we just put it out there, and our idea turned out to be right. So millions of people, they just went after our product. We had zero in the beginning. We had zero marketing spend.
Okay, so the video and then.
Oh yeah, I appreciated this. This is cool for Stelleo because we talked this before the other day here in the conference. But instead, all these things that we are talking here together for. What is the problem to Brazil? What is the relevant problem to Brazil to solve? What is the high tech is almost seeing that? We can test the video anyway. And how can you put this together with a new tech that can provide a new market to explore? So I try to illustrate with that animation that says we can do a lot of IoT techs and logistical transportation. And when Stelleo goes to the information that, I go to the airport and someone has to think about mobility. And I see this solution here, and I try to ask you guys how you think the IoT can provide open source solution that will be applied to all the logistical markets in Brazil. It is a huge one. It is a huge territory that we have to prove all your goods and service. And my question is, IoT solutions with these open source techs for people who know better than people who make this, do products and service for the people. So how you guys think about this IoT solution applied to logistics interpretation market in an open source solution?
Yeah, that's a very specific question. But you mentioned open source, and that got me thinking. Open source was a phrase coined by Tim O'Reilly. Tim O'Reilly, of course, is a writer and very strong and the maker movement, I guess, is what he's into these days. And Tim has this thing about what is a true unicorn. Of course, we're talking about technology here, and everyone wants to find the next unicorn, which is a $1 billion valuation company. But what Tim says about a true unicorn is a company that makes you really surprised when you first experience their product. So going back to open source, I think that is probably the right way to develop something around IoT. I am not an IoT expert in any way.
So let me pick
I'll
up
let
on
you
that.
talk
So,
about that.
very short. Again, IoT is one of the terms you should be terrified by. And the reason is the internet is based on a small set of really profound insights, almost all of which are missing in what's today called IoT. So I'd say the most important one is what's called the end-to-end principle. And a way to say it is an old telephone, what it does was determined by the phone switch. And so to change the phone, you had to change the phone switch, and there was no innovation. The architecture of the internet is based on what the internet does is determined by what you connect to it, not how it's constructed. And that's beautifully enshrined in what's called the end-to-end principle. Most IoT is a dumb device connected to a server far away, and to change what the device does, you need access to the server, which means you can't innovate at the edges, which means you're reinventing plain old phone service.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
And so there are about 4 of these, but one of the core ones is if it's really IoT, you can change the application at the edges, not at the center. And there's about 3 other ones. And so what I would suggest is if you want to do that, don't believe the hype of IoT, and go back and learn how the internet really works.
Okay, thank you very much, guys.